Welcome to Beyond the Pew. So excited. Pastor Bruce.
Pastor Eric Gill. Another episode. I'm not sure, but we're back.
We're back again.
Season 5. We're still in Season 5, though.
Season 5.
And we are wrapping things into the Christmas season.
This is the holiday.
And
this is the season.
Yes, it is the season.
For the holidays.
And Jesus is the reason for the season. Did you know that, Eric? There's a lot of people who wear pins and signs and things like that. Jesus is the reason for the season, Brian. And most
speaking
of you
of Brian,
I was just going to say, most people watching,
we
they
have
know
a
our
special
guest today. He's a repeat guest.
He's not a guest at this point. He's family.
He is family here.
He's family.
Beyond the Pew veteran, we could even say now. Beyond the Pew veteran. Pastor Bryan Jones, welcome to Beyond the Pew. We're glad you're here. We're glad you're here. Absolutely.
Pastor Bryan Jones, why don't you just tell them quickly? Because we may have got new listeners from the last time he was here.
That's possible.
Really possible from all around the world. So why don't you just tell them very briefly who you are? What do you do here at Maranatha?
So my name's Brian. I'm the outreach pastor here at Maranatha. I kind of have two primary categories, outreach and evangelism. So my goal or my job is to make sure that the church is engaging the community, loving the community, pointing people towards Christ. But then on the other side of that, trying to move the church to regularly and consistently be sharing their faith. So those are kind of my two primary roles.
Excellent. Yeah. You do a fantastic job in that role, Brian. And so we're glad that you're in the role that you're in.
And then if you've been watching Beyond the Pew, this is one of the reasons why we're excited to have him today is because some of the recent guests that we have had, they have shared how proactively they've been sharing the gospel in their lives. And then we have casually mentioned, too, what we call the 1A Way, which is an initiative that you started. You mentioned it many times how it is a way of life, right? What do you mean by that?
Well, I think evangelism in general for Christians shouldn't necessarily be looked at as like an activity that we do. So the 1-8 way was a way to put it before them as Christ calls us in Acts 1:8 to be his witnesses. It was a way to frame it in such a way that it's like a part of who we are. You know, we had 4 primary objectives in that, and that was to recognize the gospel, to identify those who don't know Christ, to invest in their lives by prayer and planning, and then to share the gospel. And I wanted to move beyond just a step or a set of activities that they do and make it a part of who we are. We're just people who are naturally engaging and investing in people's lives for the sake of the gospel. Because when we do that, I think that's the life that Christ intended us to live. If you look at his examples throughout Scripture, like he didn't just evangelize as an activity, it was who he was. Like as you look through the Gospels, you see Christ encounter person after person and just engaging with them and sharing the hope and the good news that ultimately was him. So
and just for people listening, maybe that they don't know what the 1-8 Way is. If they're part of Maranatha, they heard about it. As we had this as a fall initiative for our evangelism, right? But it was a church-wide evangelism initiative where we really challenged, encouraged our people with those 4 areas you mentioned, based upon Acts 1:8. But it was called the 1-8 Way. And so one of the things that strike me about that, and I think it's an interesting point that you make, a lot of times specifically, it feels like when it comes to sharing the gospel or evangelism, people look at it as like a box to check. Mm-hmm. Like, okay, I went throughout my day today and I had an opportunity to share the gospel. Check. I checked that box off, as opposed to this is my identity, right? Yeah. My identity is a follower of Christ. So I need to make this a part of my daily living as opposed to just an initiative or checkbox. But sometimes having an initiative is a catalyst, right, to see that happen. And we had a lot of great stories that we heard coming out of that evangelism initiative of people who did that.
And I think, too, like one of the things that I think made this initiative so exciting is that it empowered the people and encouraged the people to be the ones to go out and share the gospel. You know, one of the things about the sharing the gospel that is detrimental is that a lot of times it feels that it's a responsibility of those that are in ministry, the pastors, the church leaders, that it's their responsibility to be the ones that need to be the ones that need to be vocal, whereas it's their responsibility of every single believer to be the ones to go out and share the gospel. Can you speak a little bit more about that, Jones?
Yeah. So one of the things that I was thinking about talking about this morning is this thing called plausibility structures. And plausibility structures are these structures that we build in our lives, and we basically receive, or it's like a lens that we look at truth from. And the most powerful plausibility structure, well, I'll mention the three first. So one is community, the other one is experiences, and the other one is facts. And it's interesting because when you think about plausibility structures, you might think that the most powerful one is facts, but it's actually not. The most powerful one is community. It's showing the power of relationships. And I think that's part of the reason, like when we think about how we're built within community and relationally, that's why it's so important for it to be something that everyone is doing and not just, a pastor or evangelist, because you have people in your sphere, or, whoever's listening, like you have people in your sphere that me as a pastor and maybe even someone gifted evangelist will never be able to reach. Mm-hmm. They're not going to necessarily listen to me, but you having that relationship with them already gives you a door and an opportunity to be heard. So it's important for each and every one of us to be engaging this, one, because Christ has called us to, but because he's given you a fertile ground right where you are with the relationships that you already have too.
Yeah, and I think what's interesting about that, and this is in some ways a indictment that the world, or those that do not know Christ, like to, wave towards the church, is that the church people are one way in church, one way outside of church, one way with their family, one way with their friends. Almost like there's a lot of different presentations of self. Yeah. But what you're talking about, where there are individuals that they rub shoulders with and interact, all of us, on a daily basis, if the gospel is a way of life for us, mm-hmm. if Christ is our life, there doesn't have to be this effort to try to change how we interact with folks that maybe are lost, yep. because what will emanate from us, what will flow forth from us, is the light of Christ, mm-hmm. is the love of Christ. And so that whole idea of it being a way of life speaks directly to that. Mm-hmm. And you're right on. Like there's people, like even thinking about my daughters, there's individuals that they rub shoulders with their friends in the high school, in the middle school, that they have opportunity to have influence in their lives and to be Christ to them, that I don't have that opportunity. Yep. There's other individuals, people who are listening right now. You might be in a place of employment, work, wherever, and you're the only follower of Christ that people will interact with. Mm-hmm. And it's not a matter of, okay, so put on a good show or put on a good front. It's be Christ to them. It's model Christ likeness to them. And you can't do that independent of the gospel. Yeah. I mean, that has to emanate from us, for sure. So I think it's a great challenge.
Yeah, I think, like when we talk about the 1-8 way, the last objective, we say share. And the goal behind share is to share your life and share the gospel. Yeah. Like you're extending, yep. we want to prioritize speaking the gospel to them, because that's how people come to know Christ, by hearing the gospel declared, but also like sharing our lives with them too. So,
and that's what Paul said, right? Paul said to the Thessalonian believers, we imparted to you not only the gospel, but our very lives. Mm-hmm. And so that's a model.
And I think that's the part that sometimes is hard too, is like sharing your life. I mean, we live in a culture that is, it's so busy. Have so many competing things that for you to put yourself out there, where you have to be intentional and give yourself time, where you're inviting people into your home, where you're like putting yourself out there for people, where you can intentionally set yourself up, where you can proactively think, okay, what are the 3 steps that I can take, that by the 4th step I can proactively share the gospel. That takes time and intentionality. Mm-hmm. Now, with this initiative, Pastor Jones, I'm sure that there's been stories after stories that you have heard of people that have come to know Jesus, of that they have proactively shared the gospel, and we have had good reports. Is there any that comes to mind that you think will be great for us to share that could be encouraging to the listeners?
Yeah. Give a kind of a preview of one, because I think the goal is to maybe highlight this more fully later in something else that we do. But what was really cool is kind of midway through the 10-week initiative of the 1-8 way, we shared testimonies. Mm-hmm. And one of those testimonies in particular was someone who had just recently shared Christ. They had been challenged by the 1-8 way. They shared Christ. That person came to know Christ. And someone sitting in the audience hearing that testimony felt challenged, felt compelled to go and share with one of their friends. And we got to hear, a few weeks later that individual actually went, shared Christ with their friend, and then that friend accepted Christ. So it was kind of really this cool, powerful thing of like, we're sharing testimony of people taking up the call, seeing people come to know Christ, others being challenged by that call, and it was kind of this ripple effect of seeing people come to know Christ that we hope will continue to happen.
Yeah.
But that's kind of a small overview. We're going to highlight that more fully later.
Yeah, and I think that's something that we sometimes don't realize in the magnitude of the impact of a testimony of our sharing Christ with someone, how that inspires other people, right? I mean, there was a lot of people that I've interacted with as far as with the 1-8 Way that had shared testimonies like that they had opportunity to share the gospel, that they had opportunity to present Christ, that they had opportunity to be able to tell someone about what it means to have a relationship with the Lord. And you hear those testimonies, and it empowers and emboldens you, when you hear those kind of testimonies. But it also, I think sometimes as believers, we almost have this kind of mentality of defeat. Like, I'm going to share Christ, but nothing's going to happen. Like we almost have that attitude as opposed to an expectation that God is going to do what only God can do. And so we're told in Scripture that the gospel is the power of God unto salvation for everyone who believes. Not that it contains the power. It is the power, right? And so when we go with the gospel of Christ, we go with this boldness, but also this encouragement that we have confidence God is going to do exactly as he intends to do with his word. And that's out of our hands, so the pressure's off. Yeah. But also, we should have great expectation and joy in sharing that God's going to do what only God can do. Yeah. And when we hear testimonies of that, we almost seem surprised. Like, wow, God did what? What do you think God's going to do? He said he would. Yeah. And so I think those kind of stories are encouraging and inspiring. And when people hear other people sharing the gospel, I know you're referencing one of the services where we had 3 people share a testimony. And what I heard, and I think was the case even for me as I'm sitting in the pew watching this, is that, okay, here are 3 people who are not pastors or necessarily trained in gospel presentation. They're normal church people that are faithfully sharing the gospel. Yep. And you listen to them and you're like, man, like anybody can share the gospel in their sphere of influence. And it really is encouraging to hear that. And I think it's also a encouragement just to our people. Like they did a good job with this, in taking the gospel and sharing it with people.
And I think to your point, Bruce, it's like there has to be a recognition on our end of what the gospel is. Like you said, the power of the gospel for salvation. It is the power. And I think when you read the passage that Paul says that right before he make that statement, he says, I'm eager to share with you the news. Yeah. And I think that the reason why he's eager is because he himself recognized this is the power. So there is a sense of eagerness for him to go to Rome to share this message because he knows this message has the power to change lives. And I think for us, what does it is that we forget that the message that we have been entrusted with can change life. And on my end, I mean, I know the 2 of you have the gift of evangelism, whereas I don't. And I know for me, I can come up with a lot of excuses as to why I'm not going to share it. And even as a pastor and as someone who's gone through many evangelistic trainings, I still can come up with excuses as to why I'm not going to share, right? Sure. And at the end of the day, what comes down to is like, do I recognize the message that I've been entrusted to share? Yeah. And when you come to that recognition, there's no arguing around it. Sure. We need to go out and share it, and so that's something that wrapping our mind around it is important. And so as we getting closer to the holidays, Christmas, is a great opportunity for people tend to be receptive to hear about Jesus. You see it everywhere. This is the season where you joke around. Good opportunity to invite people to church. Is there any advice and encouragements that you would tell to our listeners? Say, hey, in this time, here are some tips that we would encourage you to do as you go out to share the gospel to people.
Yeah, I'd say the number one thing I would recommend is to sow a lot of seed. When you look at who are the most fruitful people, it's the people that are out there sowing the most seed. I remember the first time we ever had a garden, I didn't really know what I was doing, and I just dumped a bunch of seeds into the soil. And the next thing we know, we had like 75 tomato plants that sprouted up, and then we had to replant them and reposition them and all that. But like when you think about it, if we believe the gospel is the power of God and on salvation, like Man, let's be sharing that as much as we can. And what's beautiful about the holidays, if you look statistically, people are so open-minded to spiritually oriented things, Christmas-oriented things. They're open to invitations to church. Like when you look at the statistics that are out there, like people are curious, people are seeking, and they're open to those conversations. So my biggest recommendation would be to sow a lot of seed during the holiday, really at any season, but at the holiday season, there is an abundance of opportunities to turn conversations or everyday conversations into gospel conversations. So that would be my biggest recommendation. I don't know if you want practical tips for evangelism.
Well, I was just going to say, even going off what you're talking about, one of the reasons people a lot of times give for not sharing the gospel is like, I don't know how to bring it up.
Mm-hmm.
Right? Like, so how do I, in a normal conversation, just steer things in a direction of, let's talk about Jesus? When you think about Christmas, like literally, it is to celebrate the birth of Christ,
Jesus. Yep.
like Christ coming to us, right? And so at Christmas, unlike most other times of the year, I mean, even when you think about like Easter, people don't necessarily refer to it as Resurrection Sunday. Yeah. So there's people who celebrate Easter that may have no idea when they celebrate Easter that it's anything more than the Easter bunny and eggs. But when you talk about Christmas and it's the birth of Christ, you can go to stores, businesses, community centers, and they have nativities outside of their business, outside of their stores. They have, signs that talk about Merry Christmas, and it's about the birth of Christ. And so as a believer, this is very much like low-hanging fruit when we're talking about Christmas, because it's already brought up for us to be able to give glory to the Lord. And I do think sometimes we can overcomplicate things, but simple statements, simple words, simple conversations can steer things in a direction to be able to share Christ with people at Christmas.
I mean, there's all kinds of illustrations with it. Like you see lights, what that represents. Like, with the light of the world coming and all the songs that we have. Like, the conversation transitions theoretically are supernatural if our minds are oriented towards the gospel.
Yes.
And that's the harder part. Like we got to make sure that our minds are oriented towards the gospel and the good news during this season. And then I think we will see those things. And we do that through prayer. We do that through staying in his word, through accountability, different things like that. But Yeah, and
a simple question, I think, even when it comes to Christmas and people celebrating the birth of Christ, is the simple question of, why did Christ come? Why did he have to come? Because people don't necessarily dive into that in their own heart and mind. They just celebrate, he came. But why? Why? What was the purpose? And even asking those questions of people, like, hey, why do you celebrate Christmas? And do you know why Christ came? That's a very simple thing to be as a Christmas conversation with people. I think about Jesus when Jesus talked to his disciples and said, "You are a city on a hill that cannot be hidden." And truly, as believers, we should not be able to hide the light of Christ in our lives and the testimony of Christ in our lives. And so this is an opportunity, I believe, at Christmas in particular, to be able to say, like, here it is. And so hopefully believers will latch on to that and share that.
Yeah, and it's a great time too to encourage family to invite to church. I mean, most churches, whether it's Maranatha or other churches in the area, there's most likely they're doing something for Christmas. What will be some practical ways that you will encourage them to invite them to a church setting?
Yeah, I mean, first of all, I would say, just do it. Like, you got to get over a little bit of fear or hesitation that you might have. But I think what's important, as we've talked about, if we're talking about it being a way of life, invitations should come with extensions or, I would say other invitations into your life. Like one of the things that we try to do is if I invite someone to church, I usually say, hey, and if you're able to come, we'd love to have lunch with you afterwards that day, or we'd love to have you over after service or whatever that looks like. Like, I'm big on not just giving an invitation to church, but giving an invitation into our lives too. So that's a practical tip, because I think...
Do you find that to be very more successful than just, hey, come to church?
Yeah. I mean, I've definitely had more people take me up on meeting up with our family afterwards than I have just random people I've handed invitations to showing up. So, and it's because the investment or the invitation that you're giving, it feels weightier, like it feels more meaningful when you're willing to give an extension of your life. Like if I just come up and say, hey, come to church with me, or come check out our church, like that feels very casual. kind of mundane. You're like, oh, okay, cool. But if I say, hey, but you know what? We'll take you to dinner afterwards, or we'll have you over. And that's what you got to earlier. Like evangelism, like done well, is always going to cost us something. It's going to cost us time. It's going to cost us energy. It's going to cost us finances. But I mean, you see, that's exactly what Christ did too. Each time that he set out an extension with them. I think of the story of Zacchaeus, which we highlighted in the 1-8 way, for our connect groups, our small groups. He said, come down, for I must go to your house today. Like, he invested time. It wasn't just a quick invitation. It was like, no, I'm going to sit down with you. I think there's something
That's
powerful
a power move,
about
right?
that.
It's like, hey, come down. I'm going to go to your house.
Yeah,
and I'm going to eat your food.
I probably wouldn't recommend that. Yeah, saying I'm going to your house, but invite them to your house or invite them out to Chipotle or whatever it might be. So, are we allowed to mention brands on the podcast?
Yeah, I don't know. We might get just strike that from the record. And I think that's powerful. I think that goes back to what we started off talking about of the way of life, right? If everything's a task to be done, it's a checkbox, right? Then check, invited the church. They showed up, check, let me go to the next person, as opposed to this being a part of who we are and being a part of our daily lives. And I think there's conviction that should be present. Probably for all of us when we think about the opportunities that we miss, but that also shouldn't stop us from taking the opportunities that are coming, right? And I know a lot of times people have this, I know I can be guilty of this myself, where there's an opportunity missed. You're like, man, I can't believe I missed that opportunity. There's discouragement and everything else, so much so that you're like, oh, I just can't do it. But you can, take the next opportunity that comes up, but investing yourself in the lives of people, wanting them to see Christ. I mean, when Peter talks about always be ready to give an answer for the hope that lies within you. There's a given there that people are asking about the hope that lies within you. Well, how do people know about the hope that lies within us if they're not observing in our lives, face to face, person to person, what's going on in our lives? And I think that demonstrates again this mentality of lifestyle, of way of life, as opposed to just an individual kind of compartmentalized thinking.
And I think too, like when it comes to the gospel, I mean, the Bible talks about God's law, makes a point about this being about God's law, but I think by extension it applies to the gospel, the whole principle of being burdensome. I think the mindset of us, like when it comes to share the gospel, it shouldn't feel like this being burdensome. It should feel like what a privilege we have to be God's emissaries on this earth, to proclaim this truth, the same truth that we have received, that we now believe. What a privilege it is that we now get to be the very, very ones that now get to share it with other ones. I know for me, one of the most convicting things was what you asked one time on our staff, when was the last time you shared the gospel? And I remember thinking to myself, oh man, I shared the gospel, like a month ago when I was preaching. And this is me answering in my head. And then you waited, and then you asked, when was the last time you shared the gospel outside of your roles of a pastor? And I couldn't think about it. And I remember, like after the meeting ended, going to my office with tears because I felt ashamed. Not that I mean, what I would do with that, whatever you want to do, but feeling ashamed. Here I am. I get to teach and I stand, and I couldn't think of a time where I could share with somebody the gospel. That's convicting. And the fact is that we have been entrusted with the gospel so that we can go out and proclaim it to others. And so whether you're gifted or not, that's a privilege that we have, that we need to go out and proclaim it. We have an event coming up in February, which is, I'm going to let you call it. It's something fever. I know what it's called, but I'm going to let you proclaim it. It starts with a cabin.
Can I break script here and just wrap up one thing that I think is really encouraging on the invitation stand front too? I would encourage families, consider going to your neighborhoods and inviting together. Like take cookies, different things like that. Build those relationships and use those opportunities, which I think is really powerful. We had some stories that happened with that last year at Christmas Eve where our family went out. We actually did Christmas caroling, which is incredibly awkward for me because I cannot sing. And we got laughed at.
Just your family?
No, it was two couples from our life.
I was going to say, Jones can carry that. If you,
no, Heidi can sing.
Okay.
Heidi can sing.
Okay.
So actually, never mind. I won't get into that. I actually got clapped off a stage stage once singing.
Nice.
So
Yeah,
on
nice.
a cruise. But anyways, yeah. So encouragement there.
We're going deep. We're
But
going
yeah,
deep.
Cabin Fever
Sean
Festival.
Kaleli, please listen to this.
Cabin Fever Festival is coming up. Awesome opportunity for us to engage with the community, to invite unbelievers or people who don't know Christ into our church walls. We have gospel presentations through Illusionist, carnival-style games, pancakes, sausage. Really, for like in my mind, Cabin Fever is this incredible opportunity where the community comes to us and we just get to love on them and serve them. You know, they drive by our building all the time and they say, "Oh, that's the beautiful brick building there on, the corner of Killian and Pickle." But my heart behind it is I don't want people just to drive by and say, "Oh, that's a beautiful brick building." I want them to have memories here of the church loving on them, right? And then getting to hear the gospel ultimately. So that's Cabin Fever. It's going to be huge again this year. We're stepping things up like crazy, trying to have some new fun experiences that I'm not going to get into too much because I want to create some mystique.
You don't want to spoil it. Don't spoil it. Yeah.
But good. Yeah, I mean, last year we had I think 40 different events or activities, attractions.
Bruce
snacks.
is doing a backflip.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yeah, backflipping.
Yeah.
I'm not at liberty to discuss. What I would say too, and as we kind of bring things to a point of conclusion, I think it's a good question for people, like to ask for people listening. What you just had mentioned, Eric, is when was the last time as a believer in Christ you shared the good news concerning Jesus with someone who was lost?
Beyond the pew.
That's an important question, right? I mean, and the reality is, at least statistically, most believers do not share their faith.
So I think the latest statistic I saw is 1 out of 10 would have shared in the last month.
Yeah, so 10%.
In the last month, though. That's not even like regular. That's like in the last month.
Yeah, which, again, this goes back to how could we possibly keep silent? You know, and there are a lot of opportunities on our day-to-day living. There are plenty of opportunities to be able to speak of Christ, to share of Christ, and a lot of opportunities in the day-to-day living. Yeah. I mean, and they're constantly there. They really are.
And I think, too, to clarify, I think a misconception is sharing the gospel is more than just saying God loves you.
Sure. Oh, yeah. I mean, we want to demonstrate the love of Christ, right? We want to love people, but we also want to share the truth of what God has done, like what Christ has done and given himself for us. And people are searching, people are looking, they're searching. They don't know what they're searching for, but they are searching. And we have answers. So
I think one of the coolest things as the last 2 years that I've been here, as I've tried to come alongside people and help them kind of be spurred on to share the gospel, is that I'll get testimonies, text messages, things back where it's like, okay, we're gonna start praying for this consistently. And kid you not, the day that they're praying, I'll get a text message like, oh man, the Lord opened up a door here at the gas station, you know? And I'm like, man, that's incredible. And part of the challenge I put forth there is do you think that those weren't there before, or do you think that praying orients your hearts towards the gospel and you're seeing things because your heart and your eyes are more like Christ, which God is ordaining through prayer too and things like that. Don't get me wrong. But it's just really powerful when we set our minds on it. Those opportunities really are all around us. But we got to have hearts to see it. We got to have hearts oriented towards the gospel to recognize it. And that's been so cool. Testimony after testimony of that over the course of the last 2 years.
So even encouraging people listening, ourselves as well, to pray. Pray specifically God would give us eyes to see the opportunities and then the boldness to share and to be able to share truth with grace, right, in love. Caring for the individuals that we're sharing with, but that God would open our eyes to the opportunities that day by day are there already, but we sometimes are just closed to seeing it. We're so preoccupied a lot of times with so much that's going on around us and in our world that we fail to have eyes to see why we're truly here as a believer, right? And that's to represent Christ, to share Christ for the glory of God. So a lot of opportunities coming up, and so we appreciate what you're doing, Bryan, and appreciate the challenge today as well.
Yeah, thank you so much, Bryan. Now, Bryan, as a I'm a word. How do you
veteran?
As a veteran. Nailed it. Yeah, as a vet. What is the question that we ask at the very end of the podcast? Do you know it?
I don't.
Well, Bryan, we're going to allow it to pass.
The beyond the pew.
Yeah, what does your life look like beyond the pew?
Yeah.
And we do hope it honors the Lord. Bryan, we'll probably have you back again at some point in the future.
Yeah, hopefully
I'll be ready for that question next time.
Fantastic. All right, we'll see y'all next week.
We'll see you later.
All right.
Merry Christmas.
Bye-bye.